and all the healthcare professionals and my students everywhere who are interested in my clinical lecture series or my live streamings about the clinical topics. And I was talking in one of my presentations today about the motor system with its two components. That is the motor component of the nervous system, or the motor system as part of the functions of the nervous system, the CNS and the peripheral nervous system. And I was talking about the components of the motor system, that is the pyramidal tracts, both the corticospinal tracts, the anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts, and the other pyramidal tract, which is the corticobulbar tracts. And also, I was talking about the extrapyramidal system, including both the extrapyramidal nuclei, that is the basal ganglia, the four main basal ganglia, the caudate nucleus, which are forming the corpus striatum, which is formed of the caudate nucleus and the lentiforme nucleus with its two components, the putamen and the globus pallidus, with its two components also, the globus pallidus externus and internus. In addition to other four nuclei or structures, that is, and the nucleus is meaning that a group of or a collection of nerve cells together. We call them nucleus or ganglion. And as I mentioned before, the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei, they are nerve cell collections which are subcortical, and they are situated within the substance of the cerebral hemispheres. And they are formed of the caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, in addition to, which we call them together, the corpus striatum, and in addition to other four main structures in the brainstem, which are the substantia nigra and the subthalamus in the upper part of the brainstem in connection with the diencephalon, and the red nucleus and the reticular formation in the lower part of the brainstem, namely in the medulla oblongata. This is the basal ganglia, or the collectively we call them the extrapyramidal nuclei. And then we have the extrapyramidal tracts. I mentioned them. There are four tracts, which are the vestibulospinal and the rubrospinal and the reticulospinal. The reticulospinal, the rubrospinal, the vestibulospinal, and the tectospinal tracts. These are the four extrapyramidal tracts arising from extrapyramidal nuclei down to the spinal cord. And I just wanted to clarify that the extrapyramidal system, its function is mainly involuntary. It controls involuntary function related to the muscles, namely control of muscle tone, posture, balance, and locomotion. Muscle tone, posture, balance, and locomotion. That's why, in short, we say that it's responsible for what we call maintenance of postural stability and reflexive movements. And the pyramidal tracts, which are responsible for the voluntary muscle function or voluntary muscle contractions related to the skeletal muscles of the body and the limbs as controlled by the corticospinal tract, or the skeletal muscles of the head and neck, voluntary muscles of the head and neck as controlled by the corticobulbar tracts, the two components of the pyramidal tract, corticospinal, anterior and lateral corticospinal, and the corticobulbar tract. So extrapyramidal, its function is mainly involuntary, while pyramidal is voluntary, responsible for voluntary muscle action related to skeletal muscle contractions of the extremities, upper limbs and lower limbs, trunk, back, and head and neck. Anyway, this is an important difference to remember functionally regarding neurophysiology, regarding neuroanatomy, because every neuroanatomical structure has a neurophysiological function. So we have to understand this. Extrapyramidal, its function is mainly involuntary. It helps to soothe and control and coordinate and make the movements executed or controlled centrally by the pyramidal tracts happen in an easy way and smooth way and coordinated way. So the pyramidal cannot work without the help of the extrapyramidal. The pyramidal controls the voluntary, the extrapyramidal, the involuntary, that is the muscle tone, the postural stability, and reflexive movements which help to stabilize the body and its position and its balance. But remember that there's a difference between this and the coordination being the main function of the cerebellum. This is another issue. So the movement is an issue and it is a motor function, while balance is another function. The movement is under control of pyramidal and extrapyramidal together, working together to help each other. Pyramidal voluntary, extrapyramidal involuntary, helping the voluntary to control the muscle tone and to control postural stability and to produce smooth locomotor function of the body. While the coordination is related to balance, while the person is standing, or while the person is walking. That's the gait. And this is the function of the cerebellum, different. There's difference between coordination being controlled by the cerebellum and movement being controlled by the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal tracts, which are the two components of the motor system of the nervous system. The upper motor neuron of the pyramidal tract is in the cerebral cortex. It is in the motor cortex in the frontal lobe, in the prefrontal gyrus. This is the upper motor of the pyramidal tracts, from which arise both the corticospinal going down to the anterior cells of the spinal cord and the corticobulbar going down to the bulbar nuclei of the brain stem. As I mentioned, the first, the corticospinal with its two components, the anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts, they control the voluntary actions or voluntary muscle action of the upper and lower limbs, that's the arms and legs, and the body. While the corticobulbar, the muscles of the head and neck region, mediated by the cranial nerves, which arise from the bulbar area of the brainstem from the cranial nerve nuclei. We know that we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So the upper motor of the pyramidal is up in the cerebral cortex, in the motor cortex of the cerebral hemispheres, while the upper motor neuron of the extrapyramidal is in the brainstem. And then the fibers go from the brainstem down to the spinal cord. So the upper motor nuclei of the pyramidal, this is again to summarize عشان نلخص الناس الموضوع يبقى واضح ما يبقاش فيه أي confusion. الابر موتور نيوكلياي بتاعت البيراميدال في السيريبرال كورتكس. الابر موتور نيوكلياي بتاعت في السيريبرال كورتكس، ابر موتور نيوكلياي بتاعت البيراميدال بشقيه الكورتيكوسباينال والكورتيكوبالبر، الاثنين بيطلعوا من السيريبرال كورتكس، بس واحد بينزل السباينال كورد اللي هو كورتيكوسباينال، والثاني بينزل البالبر اريا اللي هي مكان الكيرف نيوكلياي اللي موجوده في البالبر ريجن اوف ذا برين ستيم، عشان كده بنسميه كورتيكوبالبر. ده الابر موتور في بتاع البيراميدال تراكت. اما الابر موتور نيورونز بتوع الاكسترا بيراميدال فبيبداوا في البرين ستيم مش في السيريبرال كورد، في البرين، وينزلوا برضو تحت على السباينال كورد، ولذلك هم 4 بينتهوا بسباينال، فيستيبولو سباينال تراكت، روبرو سباينال تراكت اللي بيخرج من الريد نيوكليوس وبينزل السباينال كورد، الريتيكولو سباينال تراكت اللي بيخرج من الريتيكولار فورميشن وينزل السباينال كورد، والتكتو سباينال تراكت اللي بيخرج من التكتم وبينزل تحت السباينال كورد، فكلهم بينتهوا بسباينال لانهم بينزلوا على السباينال كورد اللي منه بيخرج بدايه بقى اللور موتور نيورون اللي هو النيرف فايبرز واللي بتكون البلكسسز والبريفرال نيرفز اللي بتوصل في الاخر للسكيليتال ماسلز اللي هي التارجت بتاعتها عشان تحرك عضلات الجسم السكيليتال، او اذا كان اللي هي الاوتونوميك نيرفس سيستم بحرك السموث ماسلز الموجوده في الجي اي تي وفي الريسبيراتوري تراكت، او الكاردياك ماسل اللي هو الهارت. ده الفرق بين الاثنين. اذا البيراميدال mainly voluntary، الاكسترا بيراميدال mainly involuntary، but both are related to the motor system، لان الموتور عارفين فيه voluntary وفيه involuntary. اوكي. والupper motor of النقطه الثانيه، the second point is that the upper motor of the pyramidal both components of the pyramidal which are the corticospinal and corticobulbar is in the cortex. That's why we say cortico, because it starts in the cerebral cortex, motor area, or the motor cortex, while the upper motor neuron of the extrapyramidal start in the brain stem. In the lateral vestibular nucleus, we call it the vestibulospinal. If it is from the tectum, it is tectospinal. The reticular formation to the spinal, we call it reticulospinal. and the rubrospinal from the red nucleus, which is an extrapyramidal nucleus, down to the spinal cord, the 4 extrapyramidal tracts. This is an important point for medical students and for junior doctors in order to remember so as not to be confused. This is to continue and استطراد على حديثي في الموتور system and the motor tracks, the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal. Thank you, Professor Dr. Tarek Ali.